Hello and welcome to the All About Pigeons podcast. We have a very special episode for you today, so stick around. Today we have with us Tu Yang, and we're going to talk about the Birmingham roller pigeon history. Tu got his pigeons in 1996 at 12 years old. He was the chairman for the 2012 N.B.R.C National Convention held in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He's also served as regional director for the N.B.R.C and for the World Cup, as well as 5 years total as the N.B.R.C Director of PR and Publicity. Thanks for coming on and talking rollers with us today, too.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the invitation.
Let's get into the history of the breed, where they come from, and how they got here in the States.
The breed we're talking about, Birmingham Rollers, hence the name Birmingham from Birmingham, England. The breed itself, the question just popped up today. Some of the guys were trying to figure out what breeds were used in the creation of the Birmingham Roller Pigeon. It's much disputed. I don't believe it's written down anywhere, but I've chatted with Graham Dexter, who authored a couple of books. He's from England. He's probably one of the most knowledgeable rollermen in terms of roller history and the breed itself. And then we have Tom Munson here out in Salt Lake City. Both agree the breed was created 17th, 18th century using crosses between the Old Dutch tumbler, the common English tumbler, and the Persian/Oriental roller. And so that's how the breed was created. But it was created in the Black Country in the Birmingham, England area, hence the name Birmingham Roller.
Wow, 17th, 18th century. I didn't realize it was that old. I guess I assumed it was made pretty recently and brought over here.
Yeah, well, it was, first importation that's documented came in 1870s. And the first ad that we know of that we can go back to and actually find was in the May 1881 issue of the Homing Pigeon magazine. And there was an ad, a father-son duo out in Pennsylvania had advertised Birmingham roller pigeons. And that's here in the U.S. So the first time that we've seen the name, the breed Birmingham roller was in 1881, advertised in that May 1881 issue of the Homing Pigeon. The birds existed here in the US and in Canada before Pensum. So like I said, they came, somewhere around the 1870s, maybe 1860s. The first shipments came here. We believe it came through Canada first. And then from Canada, most of it came to Pennsylvania and Ohio. Pensum, off the top of my head, I believe he was born in 1904. He didn't move to the US until right after World War II ended. He came in 1949, was in the East Coast just for a little bit before moving to Southern California and LA to live there. In terms of popularizing the breed, no one's done more for the Birmingham Roller in the US than Bill Pensum. He's the name that all the roller guys, if there's one name that anyone knows in roller pigeons, it's going to be Bill Pensum. I think that's what's fairly unique with the rollers is we, in the US at least, we do have just one, forefather, godfather, and it's Bill Pensum.
How was it that he kind of really got it to take off? What were the things that he did to really get it going here in the States?
Going back just a little bit, as I mentioned earlier, rollers, Birmingham rollers had existed here in the U.S. pre Bill Pensum. 1932 was the first shipment of pigeons. Father Schlotman, he was a Catholic priest from the St. Louis area. In 1932, he imported 6 pigeons from Bill Pensum. Bill was still living in England at that time, and so that was the first wave of Birmingham rollers from Bill Pensum that came over in 1932. And then from 1932 to 1949, it just exploded in terms of popularity. And those that had the Birmingham rollers that were here in the U.S. before the Pensum imports, most guys sort of moved away from those birds and gravitated towards these Pensum imports. And then in 1946, before Pensum came over, a bunch of guys in the U.S. who had these Pensum Birmingham rollers, they started a club called the Pensum Roller Club. And that's when the proliferation of the breed itself really blew up. And you had asked, what did Pensum do different? During that time, I wasn't alive then, but just going back, reading through all the articles, it just seemed like there weren't many roller men who were very good with the pen in terms of articulating themselves, writing articles. Pensum really put out articles in nearly every publication possible. And that really spread the popularity of the breed. And then once he came here to the U.S. in 1949, everything just, like I said, everything took off with the P.R.C, which was the Pensum Roller Club. And that was created in 1946. And as I said, Pensum really pushed the Birmingham roller, mostly through print, which hadn't been done before for this particular breed.
Was the Pensum Roller Club a competition for performance or show only? Or
Initially, when it started out as a club for the preservation of Birmingham rollers that could be traced back to Bill Pensum and or what was called Black Country rollers. And so Birmingham, England was part of the Black Country. So in order to be a member of this club, you had to have pedigrees or proof that these birds descended directly from Bill Pensum or pigeons from Birmingham, England. It was started out supposed to be a performance club. The Birmingham Roller is a performance breed. They do backwards somersaults, and it was started as a performance club. Going back, looking through it, very few competitions were actually held while the PRC was in its heyday in the 50s and 60s. I think at one point in the 60s, they had 600 members in the US, and this is in the 1960s.
Oh, wow.
Towards the end there, they started moving, and this was a big issue with Birmingham rollers in the 60s. Unlike homers, a lot of guys are familiar with homing pigeons. You can take the pigeons anywhere, they'll fly back home. Not necessarily anywhere, but a certain distance away, and they fly back home. With roller pigeons, in order to compete, the judge has to come to the flyer's house. So let's say I live here in North Carolina. If I were to compete and I was able to compete, the judge would have to come to my house and then score my birds at my property. And then the judge would leave my property and go to the next flyer's house, whether it be, it could be here in North Carolina or South Carolina or California. Logistically, it wasn't exactly the easiest thing to do is to hold a competition like that for, the PRC was a national club at that time. That's why at times competition is hard, but local areas had, small competitions between themselves. So the PRC did have, some competitions, but it's not the way that we have them today with the National Birmingham Roller Club and the World Cup.
So the competition side of it has been there for quite a while then in the States.
Yeah, well, it's been there from the get-go. There was rules from the get-go. Birmingham roller pigeons, like I said, we score them. There's traditionally it's a 20 bird kit, meaning the kit of pigeons you can have up to 20 birds, a minimum of 15, and then you can have up to 20 birds, and they perform in a kit of 20 pigeons. And we used tumbler rules at the beginning. I said all these birds came from tumblers, and so we used tumbler rules, which is they call them quarter turns. 5 pigeons in order to score. That's a 1/4. 10 pigeons would be half a quarter turn. 3/4 turn would be 15 pigeons, and a full turn, which is the holy grail, would be to get all 20 pigeons. A turn is a break, is to get the birds to perform to backflip together. And so tumblers in the old days, you just scored tumblers as long as you had 5 birds that did something. They did a couple of tumbles, somersaults, you would get points. It's evolved since then to now, you've had numerous guests on here who've talked about it. The minimum depth is 10 feet. So the birds have to roll, at least 5 birds have to roll 10 feet in order for them to score. Whereas in the old days, from the 1800s up until about the mid 1960s, even 1970s, it was still all tumbler rules, meaning you flew 20 birds. If 5 birds, 10 birds tumbled, rolled 5 to 10 feet, they would get scored. If you got a full turn, which means 20 birds roll together, almost always guaranteed a win. It was very rare to see it happen. But the difference between then and now is we have depth and quality multiplier. So the deeper the birds are, the more points you get. Cleaner, the faster the roll, the more points you get. Whereas in the old days, it didn't matter if I had 5 birds that rolled at the same time and they went 15 feet semi-sloppy, I got the same amount of points as you would if you had 5 birds go 40 feet clean fast. There was no depth or quality factor in the traditional tumbler rules.
That's really interesting. It makes sense that it would be an adaptation from performing tumblers. The bar has definitely been set a lot higher.
In terms of the bar being set, there's only so much a pigeon can do in terms of physical capability. I think in terms of, we call them revolutions per second. Those of us that study this like a sport, how many backflips they can do in a second. So one full backflip would be 1 revolution. The fastest rollers that we've seen, it's all been pretty much agreed upon, about 10 revolutions per second. So a pigeon that does 10 backflips per second starts to blur in the eyes of a human being. On camera, you can still see the revolutions, but to the naked eye, once you get to 10 revolutions per second or 10 backflips per second, that bird starts to blur. Your eyes can't distinguish the revolutions anymore. I think 13.6 is the unofficial record of the fastest, roller pigeon, doing 13.6 revolutions per second. And so I don't know how much faster these birds can do backflips, how many more revolutions they can do, but it seems like I'm not sure if they can do any more than what they did even, 20, 50 years ago. But the bar is moving based on trying to get more than just 5 or 10 to perform at the same time. The hit sensitivity, trying to get more pigeons to break or to roll at the same time with very good depth, very good so we call them style wing placement. So it looks like ideally when a pigeon rolls, you want it to look like a ball. You barely want to see any wings, ideally no wings, but for the most part, you'll see some wings, but you want them to come down like a circular saw, just all the birds rolling like that, breaking like that.
And so on the other half of it, you got the birds and the clubs and everything else that are kind of evolving and coming out from the 40s there. What about the other half of it, the fanciers, the rollermen that are flying these birds? What were they looking for when it originated and started off compared to what's a rollerman looking for now?
Everything started in England, and even back then, in the from early 1900s to about up to about 1980 or so, here in the U.S. and in England, most of the rollermen were chasing individual rollers. Those who are familiar with Bill Pensum, in his book, he called it the champion roller. So just a bird that rolls inconceivably fast, like a blur, a ball straight down in a straight line. For a long time, even though it goes against what I just said in terms of scoring, they scored tumbler style, so you had to have at least five pigeons to roll. Most guys still wanted deep, fast rollers, and it didn't really matter at times if they went with the other pigeons. Everyone tried to breed for this deep, fast individual roller. That's what everyone wanted. They wanted that champion roller. And so from about the, beginning of the sport up until about the 80s, you wanted to breed more superstars. The teamwork took a back seat, and that's where, if we going from 80 to about now, that's where, as a whole, as Americans, we've fallen behind. That's reflective in the World Cup. We have far more participants in the World Cup than any other country. In fact, I think we have just the US alone, we have more kits flown than the rest of the world combined. Based on the numbers, we should be winning every single year just based on sheer number of participants, but we don't. And a lot of that, again, not to place any blame, but we had one godfather, so to speak, Bill Pensum, and all he basically preached you have to breed for the champion roller. That is the ultimate specimen you can have. And so for a long time, American rollermen, we were looking for that champion spinner. Even though the competition stated it's a kit competition, team competition, an individual roller, no matter how fast it rolls, it can be, as we say, a blur, a ball that's just spinning so fast you can't see the wings. If it spins by itself, it earns us no points in competition. Yet that was what was preached for a long time. And the difference between American guys and guys in, say, England or even South Africa, they didn't have just one godfather. Like I said, we have here, we just had Pensum for the longest time. We hung on every word that Pensum spoke. And in the UK, they had numerous Pensums. They had numerous guys that flew top-notch rollers, and was the same way in South Africa once they started adopting the World Cup. And so it's taken a long time for us Americans to move away from this predisposition we have for finding just the absolute fastest, deepest individual pigeon.
So the breeding and training practices of the roller pigeon has evolved over the time. What impact has these changes had on the breed and on the competition here in the States and abroad?
Here in the US, what you'll hear a lot of chatter online on these Facebook sites, these roller pigeon sites specifically, is wanting the fastest pigeon. Just like humans, any other animals, there's only so much that the body of the animal, be it, human, dog, pigeon, can do. So what we're pushing forward, what we're at least seeing here in the US, is we're playing catch up, and we're catching up to our European and South African counterparts. We're moving slowly away from breeding individual pigeons, trying to find the fastest, deepest pigeon, and trying to find a collective kit of pigeons that will perform like they're supposed to. They said if you look at especially the World Cup, because that's the one that will show how we're doing against the rest of the world. I think this year, Brian McCormick, who has been a guest on your show, he placed second, and his birds are, we call them Irish pigeons. They were imported, I believe, in 2011. So they're more recent imports, and the way the birds fly, their mentality, the birds itself, not Brian has a lot to do with it, but I'm saying the birds itself, they work differently than your traditional American, Birmingham roller. And part of that is because of the way they were bred and selected. Americans as a whole, we're slowly moving towards getting bigger breaks. We call kit sensitivity, to get the birds to be more sensitive of their teammates. So when a bird goes, the other bird all go. When I say go, do backflips, perform together. And so we're seeing that's a big change over the past about 5-6 years now, seeing we're getting larger and larger breaks. And it seems like, I know some Americans probably won't like what I'm saying, is we're slowly catching up to our European and South African counterparts.
That's good. As the rules change, that's the trick, right? You got to figure out, you got to know how they score the points. So you want to have a kit of birds that know how to rack up those points.
And going back, you talked about how the breed has changed and with scoring. When the World Cup started, it started in 1991. back then there was a unofficially a half second rule, meaning if the birds broke, or when I say break again, roller terminology, when five birds, at least five birds perform a backflip together, a break. If three went and then half a second later, blink of an eye, two more went, that'd be five. You could count that as five pigeons. Now it has to be instantaneous. So they took out that half second rule. We used to call it waterfalling or popcorn. You see popcorn and three or four birds go one right after another. Up until I think it was 2008, a waterfall, guys, not everyone, but it was generally assumed that you could score a waterfall. So if four birds went and two more went right afterwards, it wasn't instantaneous, but you can see it. Two birds went right after the four birds went, you would get 6 points, or most judges would score 6 points. Post 2008 now, it has to be instantaneous. So if four birds go and then two go right after, you get 0 points. That's not a break. You need five minimum. Four went, and then two more went. So you have a four-bird break, a two-bird break, no score. And so that's what has changed a lot, is cleaning up the rules, forcing the breeders and the flyers to be more clean with the birds that they select for their flies for the competitions.
So looking forward, what would you say some of the biggest challenges facing the breed and competition is right now, and what kind of steps can be taken to help it?
Yeah, that was something that I pursued during my two stints. Is the old term with my old office was publicity director, and it was, changed now to director of PR, trying to promote the breed. The two biggest, things that are hindering Birmingham rollers, one, definitely the increase of birds of prey, bops, hawks and falcons. You can't blame the birds of prey. Our breed just entices birds of prey because when you do a backflip, they look like a hurt pigeon, right? You imagine a bird doing a backflip to a hawk, to a falcon. It looks like this bird is stumbling from the rest of the flock, the rest of the kit. So they tend to go after those birds. And if you talk to a lot of rollermen, they get upset because when they lose a pigeon, oftentimes it's your best performer, because that performer is the one that's doing the most backflips, going the deepest. So the hawk or falcons will lock in on that particular bird. And so birds of prey is definitely, to me, our largest problem. And the second would be attracting younger fanciers, younger members, younger flyers. But I think that is a problem that is across the board for all pigeon breeds and animal husbandry as a whole.
Yeah, there was an article I read about culpability, basically, where they said if you know you're going to lose so many pigeons, and you're breeding not anymore to just breed for a good bird, you're breeding for like predator cessation.
Correct. Yes. It's a double-edged sword, because I get the sentiment. I mean, there are guys out in Southern California. I use Southern California a lot because sheer numbers. There's probably more fanciers, more rollermen in just LA County than the rest of the US all combined. So the large concentration of rollermen in LA. I know of at least four guys that say they breed 500 or more rollers just so they can end up with 60 birds at the end of the year. So
Wow.
they're breeding hundreds of pigeons. But the bad part is, and they know this too, they understand it, but they feel like, if I don't do this, I won't have the numbers. The more you fly and you feed the birds, as we call them, you're giving them a buffet. They can't chase the homers for the most part. Homers tend to get away more often than not. The rollers not so much, because they do the backflips. They get targeted, and they're slower flyers than homers. And so a lot of the guys, like you said, they're breeding more pigeons because they say, well, I'm going to lose so many, so I need to breed more to keep up. But all you're doing is feeding the birds of prey. And now, instead of migrating or going elsewhere, they're going to stay, because they know, hey, if I stay here every day at 4 or 5, this guy is going to let out 20 pigeons. And then in another hour, he's going to let out another 20 pigeons. And right down the road, this other guy's letting out 20 pigeons. And it's hard, because I can't tell the guys breed less, because if they fly the same amount, they're not going to have any birds less. But by breeding more, just keep feeding. You just keep feeding and feeding. These predators, they're going to stay. They're not going to go anywhere. And that's the hard part for a lot of guys, is trying to figure out how to prevent losses to birds of prey.
We're going to be doing an episode. We're going to be talking with a longtime falconer, about some legal deterrents and stuff, what you can do, mix your flight times and stuff.
Yep.
What's the real solution here? Should we start getting, lobbyists, pigeon fanciers get
See,
together?
that's realistically, I mean, the only way change actually happens here, especially here in the States, anywhere else, is lobbying. With that comes money. And of course, birds of prey, they're federally protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So there's very little wiggle room around it. Guys have talked about creating a database to show how many birds they've lost to hawks and falcons, and sending that to Fish and Wildlife Services. We've talked about trying to keep a database and guys taking pictures of how many birds they lose a year, but at the same time, I don't know how much sympathy we'll gain from the policymakers of, I mean, because most guys still, I mean, general public, when I say most guys, the general public still look at pigeons as, rats with wings. And like I said, lobbying, if we had the money and we could lobby, that would be the way to go. But realistically, I don't know if we're going to get any public support within the roller group. We've talked about the possibility of trying to, because we don't have money. The roller game, Birmingham rollers are, we call it the blue collar poor man's sport. A lot of the guys with money, they fly, if you want performance pigeons, they fly racing homers. There's been talks of trying to form some sort of allegiance with the AU, combat the Hawks and Falcons. Everyone has their own agenda. It's hard. I wish I could say there was a way around it to solve the problem as a whole, but individually, like I said, the only legal way around it is to get a depredation permit, which allows anybody, if you get the permit, it allows you to legally take hawks and or falcons depending on what you've been approved for. So that's the only, and I must say this again to anyone listening, that's the only legal way to take a hawk or a falcon. Shooting it without a permit is illegal, and you're looking at on a minimum of $5,000 to $7,000 fine and prison time, which is not worth it. So anybody out there, if you're looking to take care of your hawk or falcon issue, do it legally. Apply for a federal, they call them take permits, a depredation permit through the U.S. government that supersedes whatever a state law that you have, and that will allow you to take a certain number of hawks and or falcons depending on your location and what the problem bird is.
Well, that's interesting. I've never heard of that. I've heard of guys, be like, well, maybe I can just become a falconer and do that. It's like that takes years.
That takes years. Yeah, and yeah, I say, guys, you don't just become one. You have to take you pass the test, and you have to study under a master falconer for at least
That's
a
right. Yeah.
year. So that's the only legal way. That's the only legal way is to apply for, they call it, it's a depredation permit. You can just look it up, a depredation permit, and it's $100. You apply. You tell them, what particular species has been hunting your livestock, your animals. In our case, Birmingham rollers or racing homers or pigeons, whatever it is that you choose to fly. It's just a 2-page application, front and back. Send pictures if you have pictures of the hawks taking your pigeons. Note how many birds you have lost. I applied for one in 2019 and June of 2019, and I was able to get a depredation permit, and it allowed me to take 4 Cooper's hawk a year. So from June 2019 until June 2020, I was allowed to take 4. I was allowed to trap as many as I wanted. I could legally kill 4. So any other birds that you trap, if once you've taken your 4, any other birds that you trap legally, once you get the permit, one of the game wardens will call and talk to you, and what you do is you have to find a falconer. So I found a falconer in Charlotte. My issue was just Coopers. I had red tails, but the red tails were unsuccessful in hunting. But I did trap a red tail one time, and I called the falconer in Charlotte. We met in the middle. I live in a town called Hickory, and the falconer lived in Charlotte. So we met about 30 minutes away from both of our places in a town called Gastonia, and then I would give him the red tail. And so that's legally the only way to do it. The federal government allows you to take a certain number, and once you get to your limit, legally, you have to stop, and then you can contact a falconer who can trap for you, or you can trap, and you must take those birds and give it to the falconer. You cannot take or kill any more than what your permit allows. And then after the 1 year permit is up, you can reapply. I reapplied in May of 2020. It was $100, and just got a letter saying my renewal was denied. They don't give you a reason, but that's what it was.
That seems like it's a practical situation to do right there.
It's the only legal way to do it, but a lot of guys are worried because once you do that, then you open your yard. And I feel like if you're following the law, nothing to worry about you, but you do open your yard up to your local DNR, Federal Game and Wildlife Services, to come and take a look at your property if you so choose. You can have the hawk trap laying out in the open. That's completely legal, but a lot of guys just don't feel comfortable with federal agents or your local DNR agents coming in and asking to see your traps or your birds.
Well, it's definitely good information, though. I appreciate you sharing that. On a lighter note, how about this? How about you tell us you got a favorite story about maybe a competition fly or even a fly at home?
Goodness. Most recently, this past November, about 3 months ago, went to California for a funeral, and it's a bad habit of mine. Anywhere I go, I try to make time for roller pigeons. I had a funeral in Fresno. To make it short, I decided to stay 5 extra days and drive 4 hours up north to go visit the Northern California guys because they were flying in the finals of our National Birmingham Roller Club 20 bird competition. So it was the finals, and Brian McCormick was flying. And for a long time, I had wanted to go see Brian fly in the finals, but it's hard to justify, a five, six, $700 flight, car rental, finding a place to stay, spending $1,300 to go watch a guy fly pigeons. But this time around, I had a funeral, so I'm like, since I'm at the funeral, I'm gonna stay, 5 extra days, drive up north 4 hours to go watch Brian, Daniel, and a few other guys fly. And I saw the most amazing kit I've ever seen. Brian flew. I was a scribe. For those who aren't familiar, a scribe is the guy who writes down the points. There's a judge. The judge will call out the number, say 5, 8, 10, and the scribe's job is to write it down on the score pad. So I was scribing for Brian's kit that ended up winning the national championship, and this is Brian's third national title. So that by far is just being in the games, for as long as I have. I've seen, numerous World Cup champions, national champions. I've seen lots of guys fly from California here to the East Coast and all in between. And the kit that Brian flew, it's just, I knew it was possible because I've seen the points and I've chatted with Brian here and there. But to see it in person, he just had birds that were, like I said, most guys have breaks of 8, 9, if you're lucky, a couple of, we call them half breaks, 10, 12, 13 bird breaks. Most of Brian's breaks were, we call them half breaks or more, 10 or more pigeons just rolling simultaneously, and it was a sight to see, and it was well worth staying extra. And to me, that was by far the pinnacle of my time in this hobby, watching a kid fly. I've never seen, some guys say, oh, the best kid I've seen was mine in my own backyard. I mean, it's definitely not the case here. The best kid I've ever seen was Brian's kit that he flew in the finals.
Oh, that's cool. And you got to scribe it too. That's really cool to be a part of it.
Yeah, so that was fantastic. So, the good thing is the national convention, N.B.R.C. 2025 national convention, will be in Sacramento. So that gives the rest of the U.S. and the world who wants to see Brian fly. He's going to fly, assuming he makes it to the finals. He's going to fly during the convention. So
yeah, that'd be something to see. Well, we're coming up against the clock here. Anybody here in the States that is flying roller pigeons, you guys have a great big national club, lots of resources there. Check out the N.B.R.C's website. They have a lot of information on there, and you can get out there and, you can compete all over with those guys. Too, I want to thank you for coming on and sharing all this great information on what an interesting hobby, what an interesting breed, and what an awesome history, too. Thanks for coming on and talking with us.
yeah, and it's the same too, Philip. Love the podcast. I've listened to every episode except for three. Three of the first three beginning episodes I skipped, and now I have to find time to go back and listen. We're rollermen. I'm a rollerman, but at the end of the day, I love pigeons. I've had all sorts of pigeons, so I really appreciate the time you've taken to create a podcast like this that isn't just focused on one particular breed. And this allows all of us sometimes to get outside of our own little circle and listen to different fanciers, different men talk about the breeds of their choice. So thank you for your platform and allowing me to come on and talk a bit about the Birmingham roller pigeon.
I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening to another episode of the All About Pigeons podcast. Please help the pigeon hobby by telling your fellow club members or other pigeon friends about the podcast, and make sure to leave a good review or at least a 5-star for the podcast wherever you listen. If you have a topic or a person you want to hear more about on the podcast, or if you yourself would like to be a guest, just send an email to allaboutpigeonspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.